Welcome to Play Like Body, Part 2, by PK Academy of Chess. After e4, c5, knight f3, black has many options: d6, knight c6, e6, g6, a6, and knight f6. In Part 1, we covered how Bobby handled e6, the French variation of the Sicilian defense. So let's take a look at how Bobby played versus d6, the modern variations of the Sicilian defense, in particular how Bobby enters the dragon. Here, Bobby beat Fredrik Olofsson in 1960 with bishop b5, but his weapon of choice was the main line d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. And here, we have one of the most played positions in chess, the modern variations of the Sicilian defense. Black has four main options: a6, knight c6, g6, and e6. In this lesson we will cover how Bobby plays against g6, the Sicilian defense, dragon variation. Bobby loved to slay the dragon with the Yugoslav attack, with bishop e3. Well, of course, no one knew the lines like Bobby. Sure, he was naturally talented, but he kept up to date on all chess literature, even learning Russian to read their chess books. This may not have been the main line then, but I'm sure it was the recommended play. The Yugoslav attack runs knight c6, f3, bishop g7, queen d2, castle, bishop c4. And this is the position I would like to analyze to see how Bobby enters the dragon. First, let's make one point clear: in the beginning of the opening, it's important to memorize the moves, but once you get to the positions that we will be analyzing, it's more important to know the ideas. Now this is what I've noted in this position. 1. Sooner or later, Bobby castles queenside. 2. Usually keeps his bishop on the a2, g8 diagonal, placing it on b3, and has no problem allowing black to exchange his knight for the bishop. 3. Likes to make an offer to exchange bishops with black's fianchetto bishop, usually with the queen and bishop battery along the c1, h6 diagonal. 4. Loves attacking the castle with the h-pawn and rook battery, and 5. Likes to have his queen and rook on the d-file. And of course there are exceptions, as always is the case with chess. So let's play out a few moves of a couple games to see how Bobby plays this position, as he transitions into the middle game, with ending the lesson with a nice tactical exercise from one of Bobby's games. After each move by black, there will be a short pause to give you time to pause the video to think how white should play. The longer you take, the more familiar you will become at playing this position, or you can just sit back, relax and enjoy the video. In the match, Bobby vs Tibor Weinberger, from 1957, continued with bishop d7, h4, a6, bishop b3, knight a5, bishop h6, e5, knight d, e2, knight takes b3, a takes b3, bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, d5, e takes d5, b5, knight g3, e4, knight c takes e4, rook c8, castle queenside. So in this game, against bishop d7, Bobby immediately starts his king-side attack with h4, followed by anchoring his bishop on b3, and uses his queen and bishop battery against black's fianchetto bishop. And, in the game, he does bring back the queen to control the d-file with the rook and queen battery. Now let's take a look at this game: Bobby vs Bengt Larsson, from 1958. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop e6, bishop b3, queen a5, castle queenside, b5, king b1, b4, knight d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook a to c8, bishop b3, rook c7, h4. So against knight takes d4, Bobby must break his queen and bishop battery to recapture with bishop takes d4, then he immediately anchors the bishop on b3, castle queenside, plays knight d5, after being attacked by the b-pawn, and then finally gets his h-pawn in on the attack. The match, Bobby vs Esperevshav, from 1962, continued with knight d7, castle queenside, knight b6, bishop b3, knight a5, queen d3, bishop d7, h4, rook c8, h5, knight bc4, h takes g6, h takes g6, bishop h6. In this game versus knight d7, Bobby immediately castled queenside, followed by anchoring his bishop, breaks his queen and bishop battery to address the pressure being applied to c4, charges his h-pawn, and once the h-file opened he connects his bishop and rook to attack the fianchetto bishop. However, he doesn't exchange the bishops until later on in the game, following the old chess adage before exchanging pieces: keep the pressure on, until you improve your position to the maximum, and then exchange. The exchange was not made until 5 moves later, 2 moves before the game ended. In Bobby vs Donald Byrne, Round 7, Bay City from 1963, we have a5, h4, knight e5, bishop e2, d5, bishop f4, knight c4, bishop takes c4, d takes c4, castle queenside, e5, bishop takes e5. In this game, against a5, Bobby quickly gets his attack moving with h4, however, after knight e5, attacking Bobby's left square bishop, along with the pawn charging down the a-file, he doesn't anchor his bishop on b3, but in the end the bishop still ends up being exchanged for one of black's knights. Bobby still castles queenside and the bishop on e5 will eventually be exchanged with black's fianchetto bishop. One more game, from the 1957 US Open, Round 2, versus E. Stephens. After a6, castle queenside, queen c7, bishop b3, b5. This is a good game to show how you cannot just move pieces when presented with unfamiliar moves. Each game is different, so you must always be ready to tailor your plan to the game that is being played. For example here, Bobby spots a tactical strike, so he decides to go for it. How should Bobby play? Look for hanging pieces. The rook and queen are hanging. Also, it's about the squares. It's a good idea to keep track on who is controlling the squares, especially the squares with pieces. Some squares have the same amount of attackers as defenders. These are critical squares which can lead to tactical operations. For example, black's knight is on a critical square c6, it's being attacked and defended by one piece. Now you connect the dots to find the tactics. Bobby played knight takes c6, queen takes c6. If you still do not see the tactical operation, notice how the position has changed. The queen is still unprotected and it's on the same diagonal as the rook, which is another clue that tactics may exist. Do you see where Bobby is going with this? No? Well, because the queen left the 7th rank, now the e-pawn is hanging. Right? Bobby played knight d5 attacking the e-pawn, threatening to fork black's king and queen. You see? This is what Bobby saw a few moves back. So how should black play? Exchanging knights leaves white's bishop attacking the queen and rook. How about protecting the pawn with queen d7? Then black could play knight b6, forking the rook and queen. How about protecting the pawn with queen e8? Then knight c7, right? Black played king h8, so now what? Knight takes f6, or knight takes e7? They both worked, but Bobby played the stronger knight takes f6, and black played e6, because taking the knight would lose the a1 rook, right? With bishop d5. So Bobby wins the knight for free. However, he's not done. So what now? Bobby played bishop h6, using his bishop and queen battery. Bishop takes f6, loses the f8 rook, and with bishop takes h6, comes queen takes h6, so black played bishop b7, now Bobby is looking for mate. So how should Bobby continue? After bishop takes g7, king takes g7, what is Bobby doing? Bobby played knight g4, threatening queen h6, knight f6, queen takes h7, mate. Black lasted a little bit longer by playing f5, but that's enough for this lesson and we can stop here. Thanks for tuning into BK Academy of Chess, where together we build, and over the board we play like Bobby.